So I'm not discounting the value of stories at all, but it seems to me that what you're doing is overlooking in your discussion of Cain and Abel and the archetype of propitiating a god, you're overlooking the obvious ground truth and its consequences here, and then telling a story which is fairly unconstrained by any rules. The obvious ground truth for me is people thought they were in relationship to a deity who could become angry and who had to be propitiated. And this led to some very direct and appalling consequences for millennia, the most extreme being human sacrifice, from which we graduated to animal sacrifice, at least in the Judeo Christian tradition. And human sacrifice was real, and it's virtually a cultural universal. And yes, so there's some archetypal story you can tell about it, but it was perhaps the most barbarous symptom of human ignorance about the weather, about disease, about good and bad luck, about agriculture, about everything that we have ever given rise to. And we are quite happy to have outgrown it. And whenever we find a culture that is practicing something like human sacrifice based on a notion of propitiating invisible deities, we see these people as dangerously confused. And any child born into the company of such adults is an unlucky one who has to be rescued now, right? I mean, the year is 2017. As you were talking, I was reminded of something I wrote in The End of Faith, my first book, in an endnote. And it was kind of pitched to the Joseph Campbell use of mythology, of which you are showing some affinity, even though his name hasn't come up. And I just want to read this to you because this is, I believe, this counterpoint to this way of talking about mythology and stories and archetypes is still valid. At least it's still what I think. I went into a bookstore. I walked into the cookbook section of a Barnes and Noble, and with my eyes closed, just ran my hand down the shelf and grabbed a book and opened it at random and looked at the first recipe I saw. And the book turned out to be a book called A Taste of Hawaii, New Cooking from the Crossroads of the Pacific. So here is what I wrote in this endnote in The End of Faith. And therein I discovered an as yet uncelebrated mystical treatise. While it appears to be a recipe for wok-seared fish and shrimp cakes with Ogo tomato relish, we need only study its list of ingredients to know that we are in the presence of an unrivaled spiritual intelligence. Then I list the ingredients, right? So it's 1 snapper fillet cubed, 3 teaspoons of chopped scallions, salt and freshly ground pepper. There's a long list of ingredients. And then I go through with a mystical interpretation of this recipe. And I'll just give you a few sentences to give you a sense of it.
Sounds like you're getting dangerously close to paranoid schizophrenic thinking there, Sam.
That's the thing. I mean, this is obviously crazy because I know how I did this, but this is as valid sounding, or so I would argue, as most of what is produced in this genre. So when I say the snapper fillet, of course, is the individual himself, you and I, awash in the sea of existence. And here we find it cubed, which is to say that our situation must be remedied in all three dimensions of body, mind, and spirit. Now you have 3 teaspoons of chopped scallions. This further partakes of the cubic symmetry, suggesting that that which we need add to each level of our being by way of antidote comes likewise in equal proportions. The import of the passage is clear. The body, mind, and spirit need to be tended with the same care. Salt and freshly ground black pepper. Well, here we have the perennial invocation of opposites, the white and black aspects of our nature. Both good and evil must be understood if we would fulfill the recipe of spiritual life. Nothing, after all, can be excluded from the human experience. This seems to be a tantric text. What is more, salt and pepper come to us in the form of grains, which is to say that the good and bad qualities are born of the tiniest actions, and thus we are not in good or evil in general, but only by virtue of innumerable moments which color the stream of our being by force of repetition. Then there's a dash of cayenne pepper, clearly a being of such robust color and flavor it signifies the spiritual influence of an enlightened adept. I go on, and this is all bullshit because it's meant to be bullshit. I mean, again, this is a random text that I'm giving a highfalutin spiritual interpretation of. But my point is, you can do this with anything. And religions have been doing this for millennia with specific books, which, even by the merits of fiction, for the most part, I mean, there's some exceptions here. I'll grant you that there's some bits of the Bible that stand comparison with the rest of world literature, but much of it doesn't, right? Most of these books are profoundly mediocre The Quran is as mediocre a book as I've ever seen on any subject. I'll grant that maybe the Arabic is beautiful. I don't read Arabic, but the content of the book isn't. And this is true of most religious writing. And the fact that most people, most of the time, have found profound meaning in much of this work is not proof otherwise. I mean, again, if you found me a culture that was doing what I just did to a recipe in a cookbook, the fact that they had gone generation after generation enamored of that interpretation wouldn't prove anything. That's the problem I'm having here.
Yeah, well, that's good. I mean, what you wrote is very funny too, and it's very much reminiscent of New Age thinking, I would say.
What's the problem with New Age thinking then, in your view?
Well, I don't think it's constrained exactly in the manner that you said. I mean, I mentioned that what I've been trying to do while working my way through the murk, let's say, look, if you're analyzing scientific literature, you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. And like 95% of it is chaff, unless it's social psychology, in which case 99% of it is chaff. But it's chaff. There's a lot of it. You have to be discriminating in your interpretation in the scientific literature, just as in other literary domains. And it's certainly the case that we aren't as good at distinguishing what constitutes quality in the fictional domain from what constitutes outright falsehood and delusion, let's say. I used the example of paranoid schizophrenia very specifically there because paranoids, who tend to be among the more intelligent people who are cursed with schizophrenia, take a set of axioms and then weave a compelling story that's logically coherent if you grant the validity of the axioms. And so the kind of murk that you're describing, and I think that characterizes in particular New Age thinking, is an ever-present danger, not so much of religious thinking, though, Sam. It's an ever-present danger of human imaginativeness.
Hmm.
We can produce representations of the world that grip onto the world in many ways, but then we have to subject them to intense criticism. And that's why, for example, we both share a belief that the last thing we want to do in our society is put any restrictions whatsoever on the human right to criticize religious presuppositions. I think that's an absolute catastrophe. And I'm certainly not claiming for a second that every possible religious interpretation is correct. That's clearly no more than every possible work of fiction is of quality. But the quality issue really is a stickler because it's very, as we've already discussed, it's sufficiently evident that there's such a thing as great literature to be somewhat self-evident that there's truth embedded in that, even though we don't precisely know how to define it. Now the postmodernists would take an opposed view to that. They would say, well, there's no truth in literature whatsoever. It's all a matter of interpretation, which is akin in some sense to the objection that you're raising. And that's all that, and I have to say, that's a profound objection. But I believe that it throws the baby out with the bathwater.